Hi everyone, I'm Dr. D. Today we're going to be talking about the systems approach and how it interprets the fashion industry. So first we'll be talking about the key issues and parties involved in the systems approach. Then we'll talk about how that approach would diagnose the fashion industry. And then I'll give you some examples of people who use the systems approach when talking about the fashion industry. So let's start with those key issues. First, the most important issues when it comes to the systems approach are the nodes and the links, the parties involved, and the relationships between those parties. Another really important aspect of the systems approach is the environment in which those nodes and links exist. Let's explore these issues a little bit further, and I'm going to be changing the visual here to show you how this system gets constructed. When we look at the fashion industry, we can see a straight line of parties involved in the process. The producers create a raw material like a yarn or a fabric. Then the manufacturing parties take that raw material and turn it into clothing. The clothing that then gets sent to the fast fashion companies, who in turn sell it to the consumers. So this is our baseline of parties and nodes and links for the fashion industry, but it's already more complicated than the parties described in the traditional approaches, and it's about to get even more complicated. First, we have to remember that those fast fashion corporations are having feedback on the producers and the manufacturing groups, so that it's not just a one-way direction, there's a feedback loop. And also, we have to consider each of these parties as more complex than just one unitary idea. Producers, for instance, include farmers from all over the world. Those include farmers who are farming plants like cotton or bamboo, and farmers who are growing animals like sheep for wool or cows for leather. It also includes the idea of the companies that producers are working with, and one of the ones that's mentioned in the documentary is Monsanto. This corporation is making huge, powerful decisions about the seeds for the plants that the farmers are growing. So producers as a party gets really complicated. When we're looking at manufacturing, we're not looking at one solitary group of people. We're talking about the factory owners, the factory managers, the factory workers. We're also talking about the neighbors in places where those factories exist, how it's affecting people who live in those neighborhoods and their health. Then we're talking about fast fashion companies, we're talking about executives in those fast fashion companies, but we're also talking about the designers and the creative side of those fast fashion companies. And at this point, we could even start talking about advertising. I'm not going to, because that will make everything too complicated, but that is another aspect of this industry that the systems approach can finally start addressing: advertising and advertisers. But then when we just stick to the fashion companies, the fast fashion companies, we can then start looking further down the line and talk about store managers and employees. Then when we get to consumers, well, there's you and me, the people who are buying regular old fast fashion clothes. But then there are also people like fashion bloggers or YouTubers. They are taking fast fashion clothes as their raw material and turning it into a new product, their blogs and their videos. So already, when we're just looking at this chain of four parties, it's actually a bit more complicated than just those four parties. Now that we've got a good idea of the nodes, let's take a look at the environment that these nodes exist in. First, let's obviously identify the fashion industry, which is the system in which each of these nodes exists. I'm not including consumers here for simplicity's sake. The fashion industry is just those companies and those individuals which are responsible for creating and selling this particular product. We can also consider some of the other parties in their systems. For instance, in the documentary, we saw producers having a relationship with doctors. We actually also saw this with the manufacturers in terms of the neighborhoods. The manufacturing process is also causing a lot of illness. We're seeing this new party come into play. Doctors are an important part of a different system, the medical industry. We're seeing already here that there's a relationship between the fashion industry and the medical industry through individual parties, those producers as well as the manufacturers. So that's another system that's embedded in here. But we also saw another system clearly talked about in the documentary, and I'll get to that by starting with how consumers are having relationships with financial advisors. Now, these financial advisors are part of a the financial system, and we can be talking about banks and Wall Street, but I also think that those financial advisors are actually emblematic of an even bigger system rather than just another industry. And I'm going to call this the super system, or an environment that these kinds of systems exist in, and that's our economic system, capitalism. Capitalism is such a huge and powerful force here. I'm going to argue that it encapsulates the entire fashion industry. The fashion industry, as least as it exists with these fast fashion companies, would not exist if not for capitalism. We just wouldn't have this industry looking the way it does. I've also included a lot of the medical industry in this economic system because, at least in the United States, the way our medical industry works is it's based a lot on capitalism, although some aspects of it are just about health and the wellness of people. I'm also making sure to include consumers in this economic system because when you identify a human being as a consumer rather than as a sibling or a student, you're really placing them in the economic system. You're labeling them as just one part of our capitalist system. I've included this economic system, capitalism, because it really is such a powerful force in how these parties are interacting with one another and how these systems are interacting with one another. And it gives us a better picture of the environment that all these nodes and relationships exist in. But we're not done yet. There are more parties and systems to consider. First, consider governments and the regulations that they're placing on all the parties. This includes, of course, the US government, but also the Bangladeshi and Chinese governments and governments of other countries where some of this producing is taking place. Consider also these new slow fashion companies like PeopleTree. Slow fashion companies also have relationships with producers and manufacturers, although these relationships tend to be more reciprocal instead of communication really only flowing in one direction, with products flowing in the other direction. Those producers are still sending their products to the manufacturers, who in turn send them to the new slow fashion companies. And you'll see here that we don't only have products going in one direction, but we also have communication flowing, and that communication flows in two directions. Finally, those slow fashion companies are sending out their products to consumers, acting as competition for the fast fashion companies. So now we have a new part of the fashion industry, which is why our fashion industry has grown. Those consumers have also evolved, resulting in a new group of activists, anti-fast fashion activists, who themselves have relationships with all of these other parties, who are trying to communicate with and activate for and send messages to producers and manufacturers and fast fashion and slow fashion companies and their governments, who are themselves potentially having a relationship with those activists. So, as you can see, this system gets messy quick, which is why I didn't include the advertisers earlier. I don't have the space. This is how the systems approach studies organizations. It really looks at all the parties and all of the relationships they have, the way they influence one another, the types of relationships they have, if the input and output is more likely to be products or communication. It's much, much more complicated than those traditional approaches, which were only concerned with management and workers. The systems approach is a very descriptive theory, which means that it doesn't really offer much of a judgment or an evaluation about an organization rather than a description of what the organization is like. It's a more kind of traditionally academic way of studying organizations. So scholars who use this approach tend to pride themselves in being an objective observer in a non-judgmental position. So a systems scholar would diagnose the fashion industry by describing the system and pointing out all of the relationships and connections, much like we just did. There is one criticism, though, that I think even the systems approach would provide, and that is that corrective or negative feedback is not really being used adequately in this system. We've had a lot of negative feedback or corrective feedback from the factories themselves and the factory workers, and that has sort of had an effect on the system. It's created these slow fashion companies. However, we're not getting much of a change triggered from this corrective or negative feedback at the level of the fast fashion organizations. So I think that is one criticism that even a very descriptive theory like the systems approach would offer to the fashion industry. In the True Cost documentary, we see a couple of people describing the fashion industry using the systems approach. First, we have someone in the news talking about how we should not judge the morality of the individual people in the system, but rather the system as a whole, which is very much that kind of descriptive, objective systems approach way of doing things.
Are those buyers immoral, or do they just don't, or are they amoral?
The system they're working for, and the system that allows companies to do this, is amoral. The individuals concerned are simply products of that system and having to drive it through to its logical conclusion. What we need to do is change the way those companies operate.
Next, we see a clip from Stephen Colbert who talks about his view of the system. It's obviously done in a humorous way, but I think he's still using the language that someone who's taking on the systems approach would use to describe the fashion industry.
Because the global marketplace is someplace where we export work to have happen in whatever conditions we want, and then the products come back to me cheap enough to throw away without thinking about it.
I'm going to link to the whole interview between Stephen Colbert and Alex Blumberg because they both actually talk about the fashion industry very much using the systems approach and some of the jargon that the systems approach comes with. So that's how the systems approach views, interprets, and diagnoses the fashion industry. It provides more complexity than the traditional approaches being the classical human relations and human resources approaches. But it also provides a more academic, objective, and less judgmental view of organizations and systems.